Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Scholarship Lab here at the Rockefeller Library. Looks like we have a very good turnout, and I think you're in for a treat this evening. Tom Banchoff has been a mathematics professor here at Brown since 1967. Tom did his undergraduate work at Notre Dame and his graduate work at Berkeley, with postdoctoral positions at Harvard and at the University of Amsterdam. Tom's fascination with the fourth dimension led him to research the 1884 classic Flatland, which resulted in a three-day centenary conference here at Brown entitled From Flatland to Hypergraphics. Tom has curated the exhibition Flatland Worldwide and Edwin A. Abbott at 75 plus 100, which is currently on view here at the library. And if you haven't seen it, maybe after the talk you'll have a chance to go out and see it. It's really an extraordinary exhibit. This is the third library exhibition at Brown featuring books and materials on Flatland and its author Edwin Abbott, based on materials that Tom donated to the John Hay Library several years ago. The current exhibition features the worldwide influence of Flatland through its many translations and its remarkable author on his 175th birthday. So it is my pleasure this evening to introduce you to Tom Banchoff.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom Horrocks. I'm going to, right at the very beginning, thank the library for the opportunity to talk about my favorite author and my favorite book. I'd like to thank Harriet Hamasi, who's here, and Tom Horrocks, who just introduced me, and Patrick Harrington, and Patrick Rashley, who's in charge of the Patrick Mudd Digital Scholarship Laboratory, and Ben Tyler, who's responsible for the poster that probably brought you here, and let's see, Mark Baumer, who did the labels, and Ann Dodge and Ann Caldwell, who helped with all the library materials connected with this course. And if I've forgotten anybody, Cecilia Morales, who is Patrick's assistant, who helped to set up tableaus. The challenge here, when you're using a digital scholarship laboratory, is try to figure out some things that it's really good for. I mean, you don't want to just say, next slide, please. You want it to make some sense on an expanse. And this expanse really is a challenge, and I think, we'll see whether you think I've found some interesting ways of using this two-dimensional selective environment. I'd also like to thank the Jovi Raz Castaldi at the CIS, and Adrian and all the people who handle the video. So this thing actually will be videoed and available. We will go for a while, and then there will be a question period, so I just want to warn you that your questions may be recorded for all time. So you have to be careful about that, what you say. In any case, I really want to tell stories, and I have to confess right away that I know what Edwin Abbott was doing when he was 75, because he was born in 38, and so was I, okay? So, well, just separated by that plus 100. So I really identify with him in the sense that he was in a semi-darkened room showing magic lantern slides to his friends and his students about the kinds of things he was most interested in, the kinds of ideas that turned him on. And one of them had to do with higher dimensions. He was interested in many, many things. He wrote 50 books. I haven't written 50 books. I can't really model myself totally on him. At the same time, I really do find his approach to teaching really important, and his approach to writing. So we'll see how that works out. So Edwin Abbott at 75 plus 100, Flatland Worldwide. We'll start out by doing a very sort of rapid reprise of how Abbott got to be 75. So can we have the next slide, please? This is a collection of pictures that I've accumulated over the years from relatives and friends of Abbott. And we'll start when he was at school, well, actually in a secondary school, and we'll end up at his 75th birthday time. So let's go to the first picture, which is Abbott as a schoolboy and Abbott as a student at Cambridge. Abbott was the star student at the City of London School, a school near Blackfriars Bridge. It was an English public school for the sons of the people who were running the City of London. And they had a committee of that overlooked what he was doing. He went up to Cambridge. And he went to Cambridge along with another fellow from the City of London School, William Stedman Aldous. They took the top prizes at Cambridge. This was very unusual. I mean, there's always somebody who takes the top prizes, but it was very unusual for both those students to come from the same secondary school. The fact that the secondary school was not Eton or Rugby or Winchester or Winchester or any of the other schools that catered to the upper level was considered to be something of a scandal. You know, what are we doing? You know, because these two boys, Abbott was first classics, and Aldous was first Wrangler and Smith's prizeman. I mean, he really was the very best math student at Cambridge that year, and Abbott was the very best in the humanities and in classics. Aldous was a dissenter. I mean, he was not an Episcopalian, so he could not get a job teaching mathematics in England. Fortunately, he was able to go to New Zealand and establish himself, and Abbott and Aldous stayed friends the entire time they were carrying out their two careers. Abbott, next slide, really, upon finishing, took orders. As you can see, he's wearing that little thing that identifies himself as an Episcopal or Church of England cleric, and began to study, at age 26, was named headmaster of the school from which he had graduated. It was a little bit unusual, but he was there. He married Mary Rangeley Abbott, and this cup is really very important because this is 2013, and this cup says July 25th, 1913. This is their 50th wedding anniversary cup. Okay, they were married in '63. So the next slide shows their children. One guy is really pixelated. I'm sorry about that, but this is Edwin Abbott. I should say Edwin Abbott Abbott indicates that, well, they were family names, both of them. His parents were first cousins. Well, it's okay though. It worked out all right. Anyway, his father was Edwin Abbott. His son was, I mean, it would have been nice if it were Edwin Abbott Abbott Abbott, but no, his son reverted back to just to be Edwin Abbott. And Mary Abbott would have gone to Cambridge. Now, as a matter of fact, she did go to Girton College in Cambridge, and Edwin Abbott went to Jesus College, or Keys, actually, and ended up at Jesus. Mary was at Girton, which had just started, not that it enabled girls to go to college, that is to say, they couldn't receive a Cambridge degree, but they could still attend classes. And as it indicated, I have a newspaper article that said that she would have been the Chancellor's medalist, the way her father was and the way her brother was. But of course, the Chancellor's medal was not open for women. So in any case, Edwin Abbott went to be a tutor at Jesus, well, a professor, I guess you'd say, at Jesus College. Mary was the co-author, really, of Abbott's later books. He retired rather early. Next slide shows something that I wanted to show. These are the only two things that are unusual. There are a lot of pictures of Abbott, but this is the only profile, and this is the only one with a full beard. Okay. By the way, there was a very strange thing that I don't emulate. The idea of having a beard under your chin strikes me as being a very strange kind of thing. And, but you can't, and you can, if you look at him from the front, you realize that that's there even in the full face ones. But he really, well, whatever. Next slide. This is a picture that I like to say it was just about the time that he wrote Flatland in 1884. He wrote it that summer and it was published right away. So that really was kind of midway in his career. By that time he had written 25 books and the other 25 came later on. He retired at age 51 or so. Now, that's a little bit unusual, but it has to do with the intrigue of the City of London School and the fact that he felt sickly and wanted to devote his few remaining months to creative scholarship. His daughter took leave from her studies at Girton to take care of him in his terminal time. He lived 26 more years and wrote 24 more books, okay? And again, she was his amanuensis and his co-author for all practical purposes. This picture was by, commissioned on his retirement by Herbert Herkimer. And he always felt that it was really a little bit too, well, I don't know what you'd say. Well, Herkimer's idea was a very favorable portrait, but I think this is my favorite picture of him. Okay, next slide shows some connections between the cast of characters you saw. The pixelated Edwin Abbott was at Jesus College, and Percival Gardner Smith was at Jesus College. He was a chaplain there, and when I visited him, and when I first started going around looking for people who, in the 1970s, 78 about, I started trying to find out everything I could about Edwin Abbott. So I found Percival Gardner Smith, who said, oh yes, I have a first edition. So here I am. This is the first time I was looking at a first edition and coveting it. And he even said, oh, of course, when I retire, I'll will it to you. But the Jesus College librarian was having none of that. It is in Jesus College, where it belonged. But Percival Gardner Smith told stories about Edwin, who really was a devoted teacher, but he also wrote everything longhand, didn't use either a secretary or a typewriter, and copied everything longhand, and ultimately retired very early because he wore himself out. In any case, next slide shows a picture of not the first edition I've ever saw, but the most important first edition. Most important first edition because it belonged to Cyril Stanley Smith. Cyril Stanley Smith is a rather famous metallurgist at MIT and a polymath. He belonged to a group called the Polymaths, which I used to attend up at Harvard when I taught there, and after I came here. I met him down here at a conference on the monastery at St. Gall. It was an article written by our friend Hunter Dupree. So he and I were both at this exhibition down here in the history department. He asked what I was working on, and I said, well, I'm still working on Abbott. He said, I have a copy of Flatland, a first edition. And I said, well, I have 3, you know. Kind of stupid of me, because he said, well, he called me up a little later and says, I think you'll be interested in this one. Okay? He said, it's dated October 1884. I said, well, that's impossible. It was published in November 1884. He said, this is a pre-publication issue. Okay? And next slide shows this picture, which is Aldous and Abbott. You remember Aldous. The book is dedicated to William Stedman Aldous by his friend and cohort at the Senate House in Cambridge, and it was probably mailed to Auckland in New Zealand in remembrance of our time together. So this was beforehand. And so I'm holding a first edition, signed by Abbott to his mathematical best friend, and kind of shaking. And I don't know how I had the nerve to say to Cyril Stanley Smith, would you ever consider parting with this? He said, yes, I've thought about it, and I've decided that I'll sell it to you for $100. So before I'm grabbing my wallet, I said, you of course realize it's worth much more than $100. He said, yes. He said, but I got it in an auction for $15, so I'm making some money on it. And secondly, I'm getting rid of most of my books. I'm finding homes for them. And he said, this is a book that you should have. And I don't think you can pay much more than $100. Well, he got the $100 right away. And I said, I'll give you something even better than payment. He was 80 at the time, I was 40. Okay. I said, 40 years from now, there'll be some 40-year-old mentor or whatever, mentee of mine, who really should have a book, not any of these books because they already belong to Brown, but I will make it possible for that person to buy a copy of this book that they should have. And not only will I make it possible for them to have it, I will tell them this story and enjoin them 40 years later to do the same thing. Now, this actually pleased Cyril Stanley Smith, who, as far as I could see, didn't have any other concept of afterlife. But this is afterlife, you know, you really go down through the centuries. Anyway, this is now an opportunity for me to show William Stedman Aldous in his later years and Edwin Abbott, and in 1913-14, he was 75 years old. Next slide. This is Flatland. Oh my God. Okay? And these are just the English editions. I'd like to go through them and talk a bit about the publication history of the book, because worldwide means both space and time. So let's see, why don't we start with the first edition. This is the first edition that you can see right outside here. Outside here in the cases opposite the circulation room, a circulation desk, you will find the Aldous first edition. You'll also find a second edition. There was a second edition that came out. The first edition probably was 1,000 and sold out right away. So they put out a second edition, which gave Abbott a chance to write an introduction himself. Purportedly it was by the editor, but it was by Abbott. And he used the opportunity to clarify a couple of things that people had objected to or were confused by. And and he also made little corrections. I showed you the article the picture of Percival Gardner Smith. The copy he had been rebound, which made it wasn't very good from the point of view of librarians because he had defiled the whole setup of the thing. But in the margins, Abbott had made the 7 corrections. You know, so I have photocopies of that anyway, of Abbott's work. So he certainly did it. And now, curiously enough, the second edition was dedicated, as the first edition was, to H.C. H.C. was Howard Candler, Abbott's best friend, even longer time. He was a little bit older than Stedman Aldous and Abbott, but he was up at Cambridge, and they really stayed friends not only through Cambridge, but for the time that Abbott was teaching at the City of London School, Howard Candler was teaching at Uppingham School. That was far enough away that they didn't see each other, so they corresponded every week for 25 years. Right now, it kills me, but that correspondence existed as late as 1939. Abbott died in 1926, and Candler had died 10 years earlier, hit by a lorry, the only lorry in Hempstead. I don't understand that. In any case, the trouble is that we searched and searched and searched for this correspondence, but apparently Winston Churchill told people that they should burn all the spare paper in their attics because of problems with planes. And so my confederates in this business who go back to that time tell me that probably that's when it was burned, or probably that's when it was burned. Whatever happens, we have to try to reconstruct that period of time. Certainly, since Candler was teaching mathematics at Uppingham School, and Abbott was writing a book that used a mathematical idea to express the kind of philosophical and theological and sociological and social presuppositions that he was trying to work with. I'm sure they went back and forth, and again, it would be nice to imagine that. In any case, that's Seeley and Company. Sir John Seeley was, again, a co-author of Flatland, and this is his father's press, and I can imagine him saying, "That book you're writing, I know where you can publish it." It was published the following year in the United States, and for a long time I thought it was just a copy that was without, let's say, there weren't any copyright agreements between the United States and Great Britain in 1884. But it turned out that there were some people who were willing to make arrangements, and Little Brown and Roberts Brothers actually paid royalties. We found that out because they have a lot of the correspondence in Harvard Houghton Library. So from 1885 on, there was an American edition. We have several of them out here. Unfortunately, the American edition is a copy of the first edition, the uncorrected first edition, which makes no sense whatsoever because Abbott was careful about making sure that the corrections were made. And indeed, at St. John's College, where he was a student, he carefully made the corrections in the copy that had been donated by another schoolboy. So in any case, that was the only other American edition up till the 1950s. But next slide shows that there was a change because in 1926, the very year that Abbott died, before he died, Sir Basil Blackwell came personally up to Hempstead to meet with Mary Abbott and arrange for the republication of Flatland. I met Sir Basil a number of times, and there's a picture out here in the case of Sir Basil Blackwell reading Flatland. And he said, "I abhor mathematics, but I love this book." I wanted to quote him. I said, "Can I quote you as saying the best social satire, perhaps the best social satire since Jonathan Swift?" He said, "No, I wouldn't say anything like that. I would say, best satire since Swift." So that's exactly what it was. Anyway, he did publish it. I know why and how. But it got more and more expensive. Here's 5 shillings, and here's 6 shillings just a couple of years later, and then 9 shillings and 6 pence here, okay? Now, by the time I met Sir Basil, he was in his 90s, and he told me he had looked up the total number of sales. They had 15,000 copies sold from 1926 to 1978 or 1980. And I said, that's not that many copies for such a long period of time. I said, maybe it has to do with the fact that it was £8 to buy the copy of the by this time. And he said, well, we have to price it high, don't you see, because it doesn't sell very many copies. So, applied mathematics, yeah. As it is, by that time, the next slide, the Dover edition had sold, by that time, 500,000 copies. And it's well over 1 million by now. Because I only have 4 of the Dover editions. In the 1984, when we did the 100th anniversary of Flatland, we had something like 12 different editions because it would go up 50 cents every year for a long period of time. Then it went back down. It went all the way up to $2.50 before it dropped back down to $1 in the Dover Thrift edition. And as I say, it's still the best-selling Dover book except for some sewing and cooking books. Hayward Serker, who invented the concept of Dover paperbacks in 1952, liked the book and had it chosen immediately. And he paid royalties on it too. This book, by the way, is Cyril Stanley Smith, the same person who made it possible for me to buy the first edition. This is the first edition of the Dover paperbacks. And again, the Dover thrift editions still sell for $1.50, I think. And I'm a Dover author, so I get 40% off. And I buy them by the gross and give them away. Next slide. There are other publishers in the United States who've done multiple editions. And Signet Books is one of the ones that I think is really quite nice because they had, for the first edition here, Alexander Keewatin Dewdney. Key Dewdney at that time had taken over from Martin Gardner in the Scientific American, writing the column on mathematics. He was, the Keewatin refers to the fact that his grandfather was the Bishop of Keewatin in northern Canada. So he understood the theological import of the book. And the book really itself has 5 or 6 different themes, but one of them has to do with our relationship with transcendental. And he pulled that out. Now, unfortunately, they didn't reprint that when they put out a new edition by Valerie Smith. And it's not a bad introduction that she wrote, but it didn't have the insight, I don't think, that Dewdney's book had. And the Valerie Smith introduction appears in the most recent book. This is 2013. This is the most recent edition of Flatland with an afterword by John Allen Paulus, who's really very, very well known as a writer about numeracy. So it continues to get new introductions, which makes it really interesting from our point of view. Next slide shows the fact that there are a number of people who think of it as a science fiction thing, and people point out that it's much more than just a science fiction story. But the classic science fiction is the one here. These other 2 books, these are forward by Isaac Asimov, and the last one you can see out here is a rather large piece of cardboard corrugated up in a mountain type sort of thing. It comes in an aluminum case. It's the Arian Press edition. It's the only edition that we have here that I didn't donate myself because I didn't see any reason to buy something that the university already owned. So this is the Arian Press edition of the university. Ray Bradbury did the introduction. I don't know how many people remember Ray Bradbury. I read him avidly when I was a student in secondary school and high school. The Martian Chronicles were just a wonderful book, I thought. As it turns out, he has the most, discursive introduction you can imagine. I mean, he just sort of sat down and wrote whatever came into his mind. He just wrote and wrote and wrote. And it almost doesn't make very much sense. But he liked the book. I mean, that's clear. Asimov, I'm going to criticize. I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to criticize Asimov. In the first paragraph, he makes 3 errors. Okay? First of all, he says a little over 100 years ago, this book was written, but he was writing this in 1982 when it wasn't a little over 100 years ago. It wasn't even published yet, 100 years earlier. And he says Abbott was a Shakespeare scholar, which is true, but it's also true that you could say that Asimov is a Shakespeare scholar because Asimov wrote a book about Shakespeare, but he wrote 150 books or 200 books. Abbott only wrote 50 books, but only one of them was about Shakespeare. But he was considered to be, and at the time that we had our 100th anniversary of Flatland in 1984, we had people here saying that from the Folger Library and also from mathematics, from the English department here, saying his work on a Shakespearean grammar really was still used as a benchmark for translating Elizabethan English into Edwardian English or Victorian English. And indeed, Abbott, when was able to build a house on the basis of the proceeds of that and other books that he had written. When the book went into its 4th edition, he said, this is great because it gives me a chance to reread all of Shakespeare for a 4th time. He was a real scholar. I don't know how he did it. He was headmaster for 26 years and wrote at least 2 books every year while he was doing all that work. Next slide. There are a couple of people who specifically talk about the spiritual thing. I mentioned Dewdney's work, but here is a parable of spiritual dimensions in this one. And if the large book of the Arian Press aluminum edition is the largest Flatland, the smallest one is the Shambhala Pocket Classic, again, which is supposed to recognize the fact that there's a lot of mystical significance in the book. Next slide. Good introductions. Good introductions are thoughtful. Rosemary Jan wrote her material from the point of view of social commentary. And when we had our 700th anniversary for Flatland in '84, she was one of the speakers at our symposium. Lila Harper is a person who came at it again from English background, English literature background, but also had a certain amount of religious connection in there. Alan Lightman is a physicist, or wrote it from the point of view of physics in any case. And Banchoff is the one who wrote the introduction to the Dover paperback, again, a physicist, even though it was recognized from the beginning that Flatland is about for space, not space-time. I mean, they're related, but they're not identical by any means. This book, I have to admit, is a good introduction, but my co-author, Bill Lindgren, was really very angry with Ian Stewart because he wrote The Annotated Flatland, and that was the title that Bill wanted to use for our copy of the book about Flatland. The book that I wrote with Bill Lindgren from Slippery Rock University came out from Math Association of America and Cambridge University Press simultaneously, and we had notes, 200 pages of notes on a 100-page book, and really primary sources all the way along. Ian Stewart wrote the entire book in less than 1 year, totally relying on secondary sources. Okay. Now he also is a very clever fellow and very good at his writing, and he wrote a good sequel called Flatterland, which is fine. His editor told him, well, let's see, there's never been an annotated Flatland, why didn't you write one? So he did, too fast. In any case, there's a lot there that ties in the Flatland ideas with the work that he was interested in, which is a lot of physics in particular. So, good introductions. Next slide. Well, there's no title here, but these are the ones that I wrote in particular. I just wanted to point out the one that Lindgren and Banchoff came out, and to lead into the fact that it's only about a 15-page introduction here, but this is, as I say, a 200-page thing with a lot of supplements. And, well, the book, The Man Who Wrote Flatland, as a true biography, has yet to be written. There is one new aspect of it, which is the fact that there's now an animated film, the movie edition of Flatland. Let's see, Lynn Raktansky just showed me that she has the signatures of all 4 of the people involved, Seth Kaplan, Jeffrey Travis, Dana Johnson, and myself. So I have to, right now, tell you what Bill Lindgren would say if he were here. He would say, this is nothing short of heresy. You've taken a book which is a classic, and you've made it into an animated cartoon, And I say, no, Bill, you don't understand. I mean, my feeling is that the people who see the book, see the movie, might think, I'd like to read that book. He said, can you prove that there's anybody who will do that? So if you can give me some evidence, that will be very good. But in any case, there are certainly new generations of students in middle school, high school, college, senior citizens, everybody who finds a way to become introduced to this phenomenal book. Okay, next slide. Flatland has gone worldwide, okay? And what does worldwide mean in this case? It means that I think, depending on how you count it, it's at least 18 foreign languages. Okay, I say at least because you'll see why there's a little bit of uncertainty later on. But let's go language by language. Maybe I should ask people to decide which language this is. Okay, never mind. Let's give it away. Next one. This first one. It's gone. This is, as it says, Dutch. Flatland Webster's Dutch Thesaurus Edition. But here is a really valuable thing. It's 1886. Okay, so just 2 years after the original. So, een roman van vele afmetingen. From a romance of many dimensions. Roman, of course, in this case, happens to be a nice translation for romance. And you have geen afmetingen, no dimensions, één afmeting, twee, drie, and so forth. So it's door een vierkant, by a square, okay, by a four-sided figure, by a square. Now, of course, modern editions all identify him as Edwin Abbott, but it was written under a pseudonym. Of course, it didn't last very long. Within a couple of weeks, the weekly journals identified it as being written by Abbott. But here, the Dutch edition really was quite amazing. This is owned by Dionys Borger, a Dutch physicist who died not too many years ago, but in 1965, he wrote a Sphereland sequel to Flatland, Bolland in Dutch, and that also has been made into a film by the same people who made Flatland film. So he is a good friend, and when I was in Holland, I tried to learn a certain amount of Dutch just for fun, and it turned out to be very useful because he didn't speak English, or they didn't like to speak English. So, and he was also deaf, which meant that every single sentence back and forth had to be repeated 3 times, back and forth, until we understood each other. But he was fine because he really gave a great insight into how he decided and how he did write his book. Good friend. These thesaurus editions are interesting. They happen in almost every language. Well, lots of modern languages anyway, so that people get the edition, and down below, whenever there's an English word that's of interest, it's translated into Dutch or French or Spanish or whatever. Interesting. Okay, next slide. The next language to which it was translated was German, but not complete. Flatland came out in 1929, but it's only about half the book. It was an abridgment. And it's not clear exactly on what basis the abridgment was made, because, well, they kept some of the social satire, and they kept some of the mathematics, some of the introduction to higher dimensions, but not everything. This original one, I think, was owned by Dirk Struik. Dirk Struik, is a geometer who celebrated his 100th birthday here in the library, at the John Hay Library. He was very well known for his work in differential geometry. He taught at MIT for generations. He also was known for ethnomathematics. And he was also a famous Marxist and wrote for Marxist journals. I asked him when he was about 97 years old what he was going to do for his 100th birthday. And he said, well, we'll have a family party, we always do. I said, well, I thought, wouldn't it be great if we set up a lecture and he could sit in the front row and smile and everybody would be nice to him. And I said, what about a lecture on your 100th birthday? And he said, that's a wonderful idea. I'd love to give a lecture on my 100th birthday. And he did. It was called Mathematicians I Have Known, like Emmy Noether and David Hilbert and Tullio Levi-Civita and John von Neumann. And yeah, really good thing. And he donated a lot of his working library through Joan Richards here, as one of his students at one point, to Brown. Anyway, Flächenland, 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 and this is the most recent one. But it's, this is something which is funny. A roman is the way they translated the Dutch, but this says, ein Märchen van viererlei Dimensionen. That's a fairy tale. And Flatland is not a fairy tale. You know? It's not science fiction. It's not, there are a lot of things you can say it's not. What it is depends on what you're going to do with it and what you do when you think about it. Next slide. Okay, what language is this? Russian. Flatlandia and Spherelandia. Okay? Actually, there are three things in this. Not only is it the translation of Flatland and Sphereland, but also the fourth dimension simply explained. Written, a collection of essays written in 1911 by Henry Parker Manning, who was a professor at Brown University and taught courses on the fourth dimension in 1909 at Brown. Okay? So there's a long tradition of all this fourth dimension stuff here. And indeed, this is a very nice picture because it shows a number of the different Flatlanders being totally blown away by the fact that there's a sphere, a circle that appeared in their midst, but not a circle, a slice by the plane. That's right. So I'm not really summarizing Flatland here, except to point out some of the things that take place in it. I should say that this is probably the rarest of all the books. It was published in 1976 in Russia, and the way things got published in Russia in that year was there was a committee that decided which books were going to be published. And each book was published 300 copies. And the people in the Politburo had their chance to go through and have their pick of those books before it ever got to the bookstore. I don't think this ever got to a bookstore. Okay. But when I was over there in 1987, I met Yuri Danilov, who was the author, the translator of the book. He was in some institute off to the side, but he came to the Space Sciences Research Center where I was giving him a lecture, and came and, because I knew he was going to come, but he bought the book. And he said, "This is for you." And I said, yes. But I said to him, "Which edition did you use? Which edition do you own of Flatland that you used for the translation?" He said, "I don't own a copy of Flatland. I had to go up to the top floor of the Lenin Library," not the lending library, the Lenin Library, where I could read the book and copy it out in longhand. Whoa. That's what he did. And I said, "Here." I gave him a copy of my book. He was, you know, it was creepy. You know, you think about this kind of thing. So anyway, that's, I'm very pleased to have that one. And I don't have multiple copies in Russian because this is it. Next slide. Okay, well, that's an easy one. Présence du futur, Edwin Abbott. Unfortunately, Edwin A, A-B-O-T-T. Bad news. At least they corrected it later on. It's the same translation by Elizabeth Gilles. And I was able to speak to Elizabeth Gilles, and I said, "How did you happen to translate it?" And she said, "The editor gave me the book and said, translate it." So she did, but she got the name wrong. Anyway, the French edition is considered to be a science fiction book, Présence du futur, science fiction. But again, a good book. Next slide. Flatlandia, this is actually one of the early translations. If you look out there, all the translations that you see are dated. The Adelphi edition had an Escher print on the second thing. There's a number of people made the connection between Escher and Flatland because, well, I mean, here we are with a flat piece of plane and animals that are escaping from the flat piece of plane and resolving back into the plane. So that's something like what happens in Flatland. And this one here, Introduzione de Arbianche, is nice because you see the entire house of a square, and the sphere instructing the square as to how we can see in these dimensions. The last one, with introduction by Michaela Emmer, is very important because this is the first one which included an electronic supplement, a DVD. Emmer made a film. Emmer's father was a famous film director. He did Roman Holiday in Italy. So from the time that Michaela was a math student in the university, he was able to make films. So he made a stop-action film of Flatland, the very first one. Well, actually, yes, one of the very first ones anyway. But again, nowadays we have these electronic things that so upset my co-author. Next slide. Okay, and this is Greek. Epipede kora, or epipedos cosmos, the flat land, but this flat universe here. Okay, and 3 different editions. Epipedakara, that's again flatland. And it's very appropriate, of course, because two-dimensional geometry for many years was Greek. And this, of course, the 3rd dimension was something that Euclid cared about because the 13th book of Euclid was all about the 3rd dimension. But higher dimensions was considered non-Euclidean, at least in the 19th century, because you couldn't conceive of higher dimensions. Of course you can, but it's a different question. Next slide. Okay. Spanish. Planolandia. Planolandia, these are 2 versions of the same thing, but again, the Escher influences is found here. And here's one place where we're not sure about how to count the number of translations, because the next slide shows Planolandia with a little diacritical mark, and Laertes Press is from Barcelona. So this is Catalan. Okay. Now it might be Spanish, but it might not be Spanish. In any case, my friends from Catalonia, most famous of them is Dalí, certainly doesn't consider that language to be Spanish, although it's very closely related. Anyway, 2 copies of Barcelona translation. Next slide. This is the next panel here because, we'll go through these. The next slide also has 2 things, Planolandia or O País Plano. And which language is this? Portuguese. This is Portuguese from Portugal. This is Portuguese from Brazil, which may or may not be a different language. Okay? There's certainly a lot of changes, but whatever it is. And again, you see the same Escher preoccupation. Next slide. Okay, which language is this? Polish, right? And which language is this? Actually, you can't give you can't guess from the title or what it is. It's Swedish. It's a Swedish thing, yeah. And but the Polish one, I actually had an earlier version that was translated by a bunch of students as a big project, but this is the published version. The style is, two-dimensional creatures are very different from what Abbott would like. But that's really one of my favorite pictures of him. Next slide. Okay, which one is this? Finnish, yes. And if you're doing Finnish, you might as well do the cognate language, Hungarian, okay, Finno-Ugric. Right? I don't speak Hungarian at all, but for that matter, I don't speak Finnish. But there they are. And the pictures they choose are quite different from most of the others. Next slide. Okay, what's that one? Turkish, right? And actually, this one is a little trickier. It's listed in the World Catalog, as Persian. But I can't imagine anybody calling anything Persian these days. I think it's Farsi. But in any case, it's certainly one of those right to left ones. And as I say, Persian is probably, oh, it's from Tehran. So that's a pretty good guess. Next slide. You notice that we've moved from Europe into Asia. And is this written, is this correct? I mean, this is the way I have it down here?
Yeah, it's right to left.
Yes, right to left. But somebody says it should be upside down. But I said that can't be upside down too. No, just right to left, yes. I think it's turned upside down in there because somebody misunderstood. Anyway, there are two different versions. It's www.babel. I love that, babel.com. So the Hebrew editions are nice. I really like this one because of the colors and the perspective and all that. That thing almost looked like no, it's just a tree. I thought maybe it was a hypercube. Next slide. Okay. This is Japanese. It's, the king of Lineland here gets much more elaboration than usual, but you have a segment there. And there are actually 3 Japanese editions. One of my friends told me, oh, yes, there's a 3rd edition. I'll get it for you. And he did. He said, it took me, I had to go to 12 different stores to find it, but I knew it was there. You really, a lot of these things were given to me, or not given to me, but identified by mathematicians who knew I was interested in it, helped me find them. Next slide. This is the most recent pair. And Zhe-Chen, what is it? What language is this? Chinese, definitely. They're both 2011 and 2012. It's really very recent that it was translated in China. So I don't think it's sold more than 1 billion copies so far. So no, I don't know. Whatever it is. I don't know how good the translation is. And I'm very interested in the introduction. I mean, I can't read Chinese. But when a country that has a certain political bent chooses to allow the publication of Flatland, which is divisive, if not subversive, in its attack on authority, or in its treatment of authority, I'm really curious. So I'm telling you a project that I hope to do sometime in my retirement. I retire at the end of next year, July. And one of them is, I've already told you, the biography of the man who wrote Flatland. We have 2 file cabinets full of material. And I also would like to find a Finnish and Hungarian and Polish and Chinese scholar or friend, or at least somebody who will go through and tell me exactly why they published it, especially if there are good introductions, and how they translated some of the key things, because they're very important. Next slide. We're almost done. Oh, final thing is, what happens when a book goes out of copyright? It appears in Kindle. Well, yes, but not just in Kindle. That's the problem. If it only appeared in Kindle, that would be fine. The number of copies goes up exponentially because anybody can take first edition or second edition or whatever edition they want, photocopy it, put a cover on it, and sell it. Almost all of these are absolutely valueless. I mean, except that they have some interesting covers occasionally. That's a nice one. The idea that he has an eye in the middle of the face doesn't make any sense from the point of view of Flatland. That's all right. The English thesaurus is nice because at least it tells you what the English words mean. Up here, this is the only one that keeps a square as the original. And this is a nice one there. It's fancy. The one up here, the Making of America copy of Flatland, I think is what? Okay. All right. Some nice pictures, obviously. And of course, my favorite picture there. This is a nice, simple form of the thing. And I like this one, although I don't see very much connection with Flatland. But the funniest ones are the ones at the bottom. What's wrong with these 4? Can I have the next slide? really bad editions. Why are they really bad editions? They spell Abbott's name wrong. And even, and this one here actually has his name with 2 T's, and they still spell it wrong. So I think that that's really unforgivable. Anyway, unfortunately, I've got a habit of buying every edition I can. So I have stacks and stacks of these silly things. Next slide, though, I wanted to mention again this whole span of Abbott's life ends up, and this is actually dated March 1914. So when Abbott really was 75 years old at this time, so it really is appropriate, and that's sent to one of his nieces. I wanted to mention one more thing about Abbott's work, because we've seen the house several times. Next slide shows Edwin Abbott's house. This is Barbara Phillipson. Barbara Phillipson was a great Confederate in this business because she saved everything. Yeah. Whenever anybody else in northern Finchley dies, they will everything to Barbara because she'll never throw anything away. And so she kept everything, and she was the granddaughter of 2 of Abbott's closest friends. Neither of Abbott's children married, so the line died out. But Wellside was the house that he built in the 90s. And it's a very, very nice house. I think he spent a couple of £1,000 on it. His salary was about £250 a year. But he had these other books that made it possible for him to invest in this. When I gave a talk on June 6th, 1984, in London, in the place where Abbott used to hold forth, the City of London School, one of the people in the audience was Simon Leonard, here, with 2 of his mates, who was, and we're talking about 1980s, he's a rock musician who lived in Edwin Abbott's house. Okay, he lived in the house. And now he's the house owner. His stepmother, Katerina Volpa, daughter of Stefan Volpa, she was a concert pianist, and he was a famous composer. So I suppose it was appropriate. Lawrence Leonard, who was Simon's father, bought the house at Wellside and lived there. When West Side Story premiered in London, he was the conductor of the orchestra for the West Side Story. And Simon, of course, has kept in touch. I ended up doing a geometric figure for the cover of the rock album that Simon and his mates put together. Simon called me last week and told me that, first of all, Katerina had died earlier this year. I had missed that, his stepmother. And he said, my sister and I and 2 other people are the residual legatees, and we're going to be selling Wellside. I really wanted to say, how much? I reached for my wallet. But he anticipated my wish and said, you can get in the bidding if you have 5.2 million pounds. 5.2 million pounds. Now, when it was sold in 1931, it was 3,050 pounds. 5.2 million pounds. Okay. It's hard to believe, but hey, that's our life. And that's it. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a few questions. Yes, Tony.
Did I miss the Arabic edition?
The Arabic edition is Persian.
No, Arabic.
Well, I don't think there is one. At least I haven't found one.
You commented on the appropriateness of the Greek edition.
Oh, yes. Oh, the Arabic edition would be wonderful.
The Arab edition would be wonderful.
No, in fact, if you know anybody who is a specialist in Arabic literature, ask them whether there's a copy. I have friends who swear to me that there's a Korean edition.
Yes. No, she just found some. I just found out.
You did? Well, I haven't been able to find it. Well, okay. see me after class. Anybody else have a language that they know about? Yes, yes.
Gutenberg has a
Translation.
file of this. I'm wondering if you know about that. Or
I do know about Gutenberg, and in fact, there are a number of online translations. Of course, the business of putting out a cover on it and selling it is just the same as putting up and say this is a translation. I think the Gutenberg one, or one of the ones that was closely related to it, talked about the inhabitants of Spaceland. They spelled inhabitants, INHABITANCE. So making an incomprehensible error in the very first sentence of the book strikes me as a way to be, you have to be careful of some of the translations. There are some good translations out there, careful translations. When I say translations, I mean transcriptions. Transcriptions. It was written in English.
Yeah, right.
But not all you can't really trust all the things. Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah, I heard there might be more chances to learn about the fourth dimension here.
Oh, I'm
Coming
glad
up
you asked
soon.
that question. I put him up to it. I want to point out to people who are interested in the fourth dimension in general, and not specifically Abbott, that we have a conference coming up. And a number of my students from my classes are in here, and they know that we've got this happening. Beyond the Box, this is a four-dimensional icon here, beloved of Salvador Dali.
It's an unfolded hypercube.
Unfolded hypercube, yes. And Beyond the Box is celebrating 45 years among dimensions in 4D. I've been doing the Exploring the Fourth Dimension course every other year since the new curriculum back in 1969-70. And these people who are going to be in our panel, Richard Fishman is in charge of the Granoff Center of the Visual Arts. He and I taught a course together in 1970-71, along with a bioengineer on growth in form in mathematics, biology, and art. Gerald Shapiro, music, came and spoke to my class just a while ago, and he and I did a piece at the dedication of the CIT. Jolie Strandberg, the choreographer at Brown, she had a bunch of students who were also in my class, and they did their joint final project on a Flatland dance, which has been redone several times, and beautiful. Tom Webb came and talked about paleoecology and how you turn space and time into space by doing geological sciences and figuring out what plants were growing around here 15,000 years ago. And Arnold Weinstein has come every time I've taught. He loves to talk about Michel Butor, Passing Time, or his work on Faulkner. He's actually coming in 2 weeks to talk about Slaughterhouse-5. Right. Okay. So we will have a panel. Oh, David Laidlaw is actually channeling Charles Strauss, who was unfortunately died in February this year, but he was my collaborator in computer science from the very beginning. So the collaboration is the name of the game. You can't do fourth dimension without paying attention to all these things, and you have fun meeting so many interesting people. So, yes, question?
Speaking of the fourth dimension, I was curious if you're familiar with Hinton's 4D cubes, and more to the point, if you've made them or tried them.
Well, all right. I should have pointed out that the Rosemary Jan Oxford press edition had on the front of it, not Abbott's work, but the work of Hinton, who was a contemporary. He was a science master at Uppingham School, where Abbott's best friend Howard Candler taught. I suspect that there was a letter saying, "Oh, dear Edwin, or dear Abbott," that's what they refer to each other. He said, "There's a fellow up here who keeps talking about the fourth dimension. It seems to be such a wonderful metaphor for the kinds of things we've been discussing all these years. Why don't you write a book about it?" Something like that. Hinton and Abbott both knew each other and referred to each other in their cross writings, and so indeed, Hinton is another person who wrote his own Flatland episode of Flatland, and there are a number of other people who've done it too. So the Hinton cubes were a thing that was supposed to, if you memorize them well enough, you'd be able to see the fourth dimension. There are a lot of exercises you can do to help interpret things in higher dimensions. And we do them. Of course, that's what I'm doing in my course right now. Computer graphics is one way to do it. And there are just other thought experiments that you can develop, some of which were devised by Hinton. And these cubes were, I don't know of anybody who's ever really mastered what Hinton said, except possibly for Alicia Boole-Stott, who was Hinton's sister-in-law and a granddaughter of George Boole, who apparently memorized them to the point where she could prove theorems that nobody else could prove.
Whoa.
Yeah, it works. Yes. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. Patrick at the console here. Thank you. And Ben over there and so forth. Okay, thanks.